Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam McNeill. I'm an extension agricultural engineer located at the Princeton Research and Education Center, University of Kentucky. College of Agriculture has a center similar to Milan. We're about actually 90 miles north of Milan, about 45 miles north of Fulton, Tennessee, 60 miles north of Puryear. So that part of the world. And I'm actually located in Paducah today when I'm home. Yeah, but glad to be with you, and I really appreciate you staying with us and hanging in there. Maybe if I go to this mode. So now, can you see the speakers on the side? I need to try to minimize that. There we go.
Okay.
All right. Can you see the slide full on now?
Yes, this is coming in good.
Great. All right. Well, I guess, like I say, I don't have videos, but I do have, well, to make up for that, maybe I have a few animated slides, but that comes in later in the presentation. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I like previous speakers' background and wish I had something like that to share. I don't have a green screen, so it's I have limited options on my laptop, but I do like those bins, and I wish, when we first started talking about having this meeting, we were looking at maybe meeting at a site like that. But we do want to talk about grain drying and storage, particularly corn, and to kind of introduce the topic and bring everybody up to speed on some of the basic relationships between how corn and grain interacts with the environment and how the environment impacts insect and mold activity. We want to look at that to get kind of start the conversation. I've got a few slides to talk about drying, and I'll use that as I guess maybe an advertisement, because Dr. McClure has invited me to speak with you next year in more depth on grain drying systems. And I just want to hit some of the highlights today and caution you on some of the limitations of natural air drying. We have a lot of systems that don't have the ability to provide heat. They just let grain dry in the field as much as possible, and then try to dry that with just blowing air through it. No heat. Maybe they don't have a dryer, a heated air dryer, so a lot of farmers operate that way, and that's fine. Oftentimes, in some years, we can get caught with poor drying conditions, and that can cause a problem. And not talk too much about that today, but I just will talk a little bit about natural air drying. But with all that, I want to lead into a more in-depth discussion on storage. And hello?
Come on in, dude.
Okay, somebody needs to mute. I think we've got someone who apparently has not muted.
Okay. I need to keep going here, sounds like. Yeah. So, so we refer to an integrated pest management approach to grain storage, and that we use an acronym referred to as SLAM, which stands for sanitation, loading, aeration, and monitoring. And I meant to say in my introduction that I did, in the way of credentials, I did earn a PhD from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And while my time there, I met actually with Dr. Robert Burns. He was not a doctor at the time. He's gone much further in his career than I have, certainly. And then I also worked with Mike Bushamroll. He started there on the faculty about the time I finished my PhD. So I do have connections with UT, and some of the storage piece that I have here, it was actually presented at the Milan Field Day this summer, so just a few weeks ago. And I think that was recorded and maybe as a reference and helped me go through this a little quicker. Safety considerations are always need to be mentioned when we talk about grain storage. I don't have a lot of time to go into much depth there, but just to caution and to say that grain quality certainly does impact safety in the sense that if we have blocked or have a clump of grain in the bin that's gone out of condition, oftentimes we have flow problems. They have to get in the bin, and that's where the problem can start. And we have, as you know, we have lost at least a half a dozen folks this year across the country to accidents and mishaps inside grain bins. So again, not going to go into much depth there, but just make folks aware of that concern. And potential hazard. Then I'll close out by sharing some resources, publications, and with both commercial and university resources. So when we talk about grain storage, it's important, and most folks know, of course, that the quality is not going to improve during storage. The quality of grain, it's impacted certainly by the moisture of the grain. That's the most important factor when we talk about storage. And of course, we dictate the moisture for the most part in the fall during a drying phase. And that's why we want to talk about that in connection with storage today. After it's been dried and to a proper moisture content, we want to control the temperature. Then that's going to impact insect activity. And these interrelate with the amount of broken corn or foreign material we have in the bin. If we have a lot of fines and foreign material, we want to manage our grain a little to try to we want to focus on that is the point here, and talk a little bit about how that can impact the storability. Oxygen availability, we won't talk much about today, but just to say that if we have a well-sealed structure, the oxygen will be consumed if it's well-sealed over time, a matter of a few days, and that will help actually preserve the crop. But again, we're not going to go much in detail on that, but just to say that is a factor. Again, the main things are moisture and temperature. And here we're looking at an allowable storage time chart for corn. And you can see as you kind of go from the bottom rows up, moving up within an individual column there, say for 22% corn at 70 degrees, which is our average temperatures in September, for the month of September. If we're harvesting around 22% corn, we need to get that dry quickly because we only have about 10 days to get that dried. If we have natural air drying, then it's going to overload that dryer, and we need to use a little bit of heat to get that done and maybe later dry before we fill more wet grain in there. So it's going to be a very limited capacity, a very slow system. But the other important point here, as you go from right to left in the temperature columns, you can see that you can actually double the storage life by reducing the temperature about 10 degrees. So then the take-home point on this slide is that we want to get corn, especially dried down to about 16%, especially in the fall or especially in harvest time, to get ahead of any problems that might occur. And this chart is actually predicated on 0.5% of dry matter loss, which would indicate a grade loss on the U.S. grain scale grading system. So that information is out there. There are similar tables for other grains, but the one for corn is the most well established, and the others, to some extent, need to be used with a little caution because we're trying to fine tune those in our organization, or at least across the country. I know Illinois is doing some work with soybeans now, in particular, to develop a similar chart. But again, if we get it dried to 16% and cool to 40 degrees, we're going to have a good long shelf life for the corn. And I know most of you have seen problems, hopefully not many, but some of the problems that are associated with insects and moles indicate that here are shown here a little bit. But the first problem you might see would be actually might have some carbon dioxide levels would increase. We want to talk about that as we get further along in the storage piece. But when moles and insects start to become active in a bin, they're going to generate some heat. You can often detect that with temperature cables, or as I mentioned, generally CO2 monitors will pick up biological activity prior to the heating. But if it goes on unchecked, obviously we can have some weight loss. For most, the only time it probably impacts the germination point here is if we're storing wheat over the summer through the plant in the fall. We want to be sure it's well dried to store well. Dr. Stewart already mentioned mycotoxin problems and showed some problems there with how insects can kind of lead to that problem. Certainly aflatoxin has been a problem in the past. We don't expect to see that this year in most places. I think we've had ample rain, thank goodness, so I don't think we'll have near the problem we've had in the past, and certainly in Kentucky anyway, in 2012, I know was a particularly damaging year for aflatoxin. But then the last point here is probably the one that kind of gets in our pocketbook, obviously, and when we have problems that are beyond that hit us in the on the economic side, are price discounts when grain is delivered to the elevator. It has insect problems. There was a story here in Kentucky just last month where there was a young farmer, his first cropping season actually, delivered a load about 90 miles away from his farm. Oh, I wasn't quite that far, sorry. It was about more like 30 miles, yeah, so up to Owensboro. But the load was rejected because of it had live insects in the corn. So he had to bring that load home. And so, discounts are one thing, but when your load's rejected, that's another level of pain that we want to avoid. So I think by monitoring the crop, we can certainly try to solve the problem before we get it to the elevator for sure. But when we talk about insect activity, we can generally control that with temperature control. And as we mentioned earlier, if we look at how temperature impacts insects, if we get that grain dried or cool after it's been dried, cool it down to about 40 degrees in the wintertime, we'll hold insect activities at bay. On the moles, they like warmth as well, but they really are more responsive to moisture. And as you can see, many of the moles that are common to corn here, the Aspergillus species, Penicillium, we can pretty much control mold growth by limiting the relative humidity inside the airspace within the bin. And we do that by controlling the moisture. And relate that with this equilibrium chart, which is actually, this is again for yellow corn. We can see that if corn is exposed to the air in these temperature and humidity ranges shown in the table here, the corn itself will reach the moisture that's shown. For example, at 60 degrees, if we're harvesting in, say, late September, and we have a humid, wet, damp condition, maybe the average humidity won't be much below 80%. That corn is not going to dry below 17%. You can see if you see my mouse there. I mean, typically it's going to be field dried. We have good drying weather, 70, 65, 70%. It'll dry to about 15% at 60 degrees. And that'll get us through the winter. As we go along, we'll see that. But I like to set kind of 65% humidity as the target. Anything above that will be at risk. Anything below that is considered even less risk for storage. And we'll take a little closer look at that. But this does set up what I want to talk about on drying, and I have a few slides here. I'm not going to cover all these systems. I'll do that again next year when I have a chance to visit with you. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I'm running tight on time, but essentially operating conditions and the capacities of these systems. Obviously, as we go down the table, we'll have more capacity, a little more energy required for the higher capacity systems. That's somewhat the trade-off. But when we get to a natural air drying situation, that's the one we want to talk about and focus on today, I think, because it can be a limitation. If we don't have heat on the bin and just use natural air, we are totally relied on Mother Nature to give us the drying conditions that we need to get the corn dried well. And I ran a simulation here to compare two different airflow rates. And so this first chart is showing the moisture changes in the bin. At 1 CFM per bushel, we're looking at 75-degree air, 65% humidity, 20%. We're going to try to dry that from 20% corn to 15%. And that's a pretty challenging condition, especially at that airflow rate, because you can see it's going to take us 27 days to get that corn dried to, at the top anyway, as shown on the yellow line. It's going to take about 27 days to get that grain dried to about 15%. Whereas in the bottom layer, you can see the blue line there, it's going to reach an equilibrium point of around 13% within about 6 days. So, and the other chart, or the other line I've got shown here overlaid is the dry matter loss. And again, if it exceeds 0.5%, we've lost a grade. So we've gone from number 2 corn to number 3 corn once it hits that line. and we want to avoid that, obviously. So what we need to do is either reduce the depth in the bin to get more airflow, or we need to get a bigger fan, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's some programs available to help you size fans for drying and aeration. But if we use 2 CFM per bushel, then we've actually cut our drying time in half. Now we're at 13.5 days, same moisture levels, but then our dry matter loss is held well below 0.5%, so around 0.25% in that case. And it's probably in that case really better to go with 3 CFM per bushel, but that's getting up there in terms of fan sizes. So we can adjust conditions depending on the weather. Just kind of comparison here on different conditions, but you can see that it's not too uncommon to exceed the allowable storage time when we have poor drying conditions. If you have a low temperature or natural air system, want to just switch quickly to the comparison of costs. I get that question a lot on drying costs, and this is looking at well, dollar for LP gas, and so if you would need to adjust that, and you can easily do that by just multiplying that drying cost by a factor of so if you're paying $1.40, you would want to multiply these by 1.4 to adjust for the cost per bushel. But you can see kind of a comparison there. The high temperature bin dryers are pretty economical. These are really be considered more the conventional dryers that we have from the past. We have a lot of data on that. We don't have a lot of data on the newer dryers that have well, where the drying column itself is manipulated to make the more uniform drying and more efficient use of the heat. So those dryers would not be represented in this chart, but those high-speed dryers would be more like a bin dryer because, well, I've done some energy audits for several grain dryers over the past few years and seen an improvement in energy use. So with that, we want to switch more to the storage piece, and I'm going to have to really step it up here. But what I've done is taken the equilibrium chart for corn and replotted it here, showing the 65% humidity ISO line as a black line in the middle of that chart. And then, so if we're looking at the average winter temperatures in Kentucky, well, I think it'd be close to the same for Tennessee. About 35, maybe 40 degrees would be our average monthly temperature in the winter for December, January, February. We can hold corn at 15.5% at that temperature and still be in a safe condition. Whereas if it's held into the summer, we're well above the red line shown there at 75 or 70% moisture or 70% humidity. So that's why it's a good idea to dry corn to 13%. If we're going to hold it into the summer, we'll get much better utilization of the feed, for one thing. And then store well to hold mold and insects at bay. So these are the recommended storage moistures for different grains for different times of the year, predicated all on the equilibrium charts for those grains. And of course, it's going to get into our pocketbook a little bit. I think one of the previous speakers talked about corn at $3. I've got it at $3.50 here, which is maybe a little optimistic these days. But if we're drying corn at a point below the market, it's going to cost us about 4 cents a point to do that. So we want to look at marketing opportunities and make sure we can cover those added drying costs through the storage period. And oftentimes that can be done with marketing decisions and looking forward at different prices in the market when we pull the trigger to deliver it. So again, moving into the storage a little more deeply, we want to check the moisture going into storage because that'll give us the indication of the storability. Looking back to the allowable storage timetable there. We want to minimize broken kernels, and that starts at the combine, but also carries through the handling system. If we have an auger, for example, that's running at a high speed and only about 0.25% capacity, we can generate about 7% broken kernels in that. Whereas if it's run at full speed and even a slower RPM, say go from 700 to 500, then we can minimize the damage. And so that's one thing to look at going into harvest is we need to maybe switch up some things with gearing on some of our handling equipment just to minimize damage going into storage. It's a good idea to screen grain, especially if you're using it for feed on the farm, screen it for mycotoxins. Obviously, different animals are sensitive to different levels. And especially if we're storing grain for a longer period, which may be the case these days with lower prices, it's a good idea to clean it to minimize the amount of broken corn and foreign material that's in the bin before we put it, before we load the bin with it. Last piece here is on SLAM. Is again sanitation, loading, aeration, and monitoring. I want to have to run through this pretty quick, but when we're talking about sanitation, now's a good time to take on that chore, and it needs to start at the combine and clean them out fully. We have, last time it was run most likely was through a wheat crop earlier this year. We wanted to get all that debris out of the combine so we're not contaminating the grain as it goes into the bin. And certainly anything the grain's going to come in contact with from the field to the bin needs to be cleaned well. And when you're in a bin, it's a good time to look for any pinholes, or if you have any leaks or holes in the bin that need to be repaired. At that time, it's a good time to do it, as well as the bottom seal around the bin, shown here in this transition. But then the other piece of sanitation is to be sure that we're keeping the weeds under control around the bin, because that can be a place for rodents to make a home, and where they can easily access the grain in the bin. On the loading piece, we want to be sure not to overload the bin, which is going to certainly interfere with airflow in a drying system or aeration system. We want to manage the trash and fines, and it's impacted by the way the grain bin is loaded and how we can actually help mitigate that a little bit is to core the bin. I'll talk about that a little bit, but if we have a bin shown here with we have a concentration of fines in the center, and it's going to impede the airflow. We have more depth certainly in the center. We have the airflow, or the air space in the bin is actually plugged with fines. It's going to increase the resistance to airflow and cause a problem. So what we want to do then on the illustration shown here, the animation, is to core that bin, remove those fines after the bin has been filled, and take it down so that bottom part of that inverted cone is about level with the grain on the wall. And that's a good compromise. It's going to, again, reduce the depth in the center. It's going to allow more airflow through that part of the bin. If we have a larger bin, we may want to core that grain or core the bin a little more often because of the volume required, or the volume we're dealing with, just to core it daily. So this is the closest thing I have to a video, an animated slide that actually Mike Bushamel put together some years ago, but I've been using it a lot to illustrate the aeration, the movement of air through an aeration cycle. And what we're showing here, and a good rule of thumb, is if you divide 15 by the CFM per bushel, you'll get an estimate of the amount of fan time required to cool the grain completely in the bin. And we want to run at least 3 aeration cycles generally. So to cool a grain in the fall, start cooling in September about to 60 degrees, and then about 50 degrees by November, and then on down to 40, 35, 40 degrees in December, and get down there about as quickly as we can. And you can use temperature monitors to kind of guide you on that. There are some aeration controllers that would be used can be used to do this automatically. But after it's been cooled, it's a good idea to seal that fan so we don't have wind-driven currents to rewarm it in spring. We want to keep it cold, and generally, at least in Kentucky, and I know probably in Western Tennessee as well, throughout Tennessee, most of the grain is moved out before spring, so we're going to hold it cold. I want to share this website that's shown here, and again, I think this was mentioned in my program at Milan, but this is a freely available website that can help you size fans for drying and aeration. Don't have time to go to great depths, but I'll quickly shift to the output table. And what you get in this example is a 50,000 bushel bin with 2 15-horse centrifugal fans. Because when the bin is full, we have 5 inches of static pressure, and we managed to design airflow rate here shown in the bottom row here, half a CFM per bushel. And at that rate, it's going to take 30 hours of fan operation to to cool the grain. If you look when the bin has been emptied, say to 20 feet, we're going to have more nearly a full CFM per bushel. So going to take less time, 15 hours in that case. But then ran the numbers on looking at the different airflow rates that we would say for aerating corn, and you can see that the bottom line on the far right column here is that it's a very expensive or very affordable option for controlling insect and spore drain, well less than a cent a bushel. And again, compare that back with a nickel you might get discounted for if you have some insects in the grain, or in case of the example I mentioned earlier, we might have the entire load rejected. So we can use temperature cables. Again, this is an older system depicted here. Some of the newer systems are accessible with smartphones, and then they've obviously some of the farm systems that we're seeing these days. You may have a fully automated system with the temperature cables as a piece of it to guide you on when to run the fans. Similarly, for insect monitoring and control, you might have pit traps, or you can have an automated system, or rather an electronic system to do that. So we can use either handheld devices, or we can use an automated device that is made by OPI Systems. There's some others out there, and again, I'll share at the end of this some resources from the industry that we may want to look for that kind of equipment. Again, some other choices of tools on the shelf for monitoring and controlling fans automatically for grain storage. And again, I mentioned the CO2 analyzer. That's it's a very handy for monitoring and detecting problems before we would have a temperature rise, for example. And again, I'll share that as well. So here's a list of some of the companies that make monitoring equipment. Second time I'm going to just skip going through. I did mention the safety piece, and of course you'll see the decals around all bins in a couple of different languages at least, generally to make you aware of the problem associated with entering a bin or confined space on the farm. Assembled a list of equipment that would be advised for working inside a grain bin. If you have to go in, you want to be sure to lock out and tag out the ammonia equipment. You probably want to have a climbing harness and tie off in a secure spot. You want to use a respirator to protect your lungs from dust and mold spores. You want to at least have two folks on the chores, so that one's going to stay on the platform outside the bin. That person obviously has a cell phone to call for help if it was needed. But you want to have a coffer dam that would restrict flow if the person was to get trapped inside the bin, so you could extract them without with limited effort and added safety. Some of the university resources are shown here. Most of these have active programs that work in grain drying, handling, and storage. We have recently worked with some folks in that group to revise the grain handling, drying, and storage handbook that the Midwest Plant Service has published. That came out in 2018. The American Society of Ag Engineers does a lot of work to develop the equilibrium properties that we talked about earlier. A couple of other resources you may not know about there are the NC213 group. That's a consortium of engineers, entomologists, plant pathologists, and agricultural economists that work with grain quality issues. And they do a lot of research and have annual meetings on that, as well as the Grain Elevators and Processors Society, the Jeep's organization there, have often offered trainings on grain handling, drying, and storage concerns and issues. So that does wrap up what I wanted to talk about today. I do hope you stay well, and I'll escape from that and kick it back to Angela.
Well, all right. Well, thank you, Sam. And again, I'm sorry you were so rushed this afternoon, but I think we got a good recording, and I do appreciate you spending some time with us. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do more face-to-face and some hands-on training, and I really appreciate your willingness to help us out with this information.